Now let's take a look at the emergence of clinical psychology and how World War II played a role. Prior to World War II, clinical psychologists struggled to make a name for themselves, struggled to be the prominent force in the treatment of mental illness. Many of them assisted psychiatrists and helped administer mental tests. There were very few training programs prior to World War II for clinical psychologists, so most of them learned on the job and through experience. In the early 1900s, clinical psychologists began to protest the APA's focus on research, the lack of representation of applied psychologists. In the early days, clinical psychologists were considered applied psychologists because they used psychological principles to address real-world problems. In 1919, the APA created a division specifically for clinical psychologists. Then in the 1920s, the APA created several subcommittees that focused on bringing a more applied perspective to the organization and to the field. Then in 1937, clinical psychologists and other applied psychologists created their own organization, the American Association of Applied Psychologists, the AAAP. They did this because they were still fed up with the lack of representation in the APA. After they did this, the APA responded by including more applied psychologists, more clinical psychologists in its leadership roles, in its programming, and decided to include their research in its publications. On the next few slides, I'm going to show you some of the events that contributed to the emergence of clinical psychology. There are two major reasons why it was developed when it was developed. One, Lightner Whitmer, and two, the APA's actions. Lightner Whitmer is known as the founder of both school psychology and clinical psychology. He completed his PhD at the University of Leipzig in Wilhelm Wundt's lab. He also worked with Titchener. He also helped Cattell at the University of Pennsylvania. While he was there, he started a small clinic on campus and began bringing in students, children, who had psychological, emotional, and/or behavioral issues. In 1896, he named what he was doing clinical psychology. So, clinical psychology actually began with a very narrow focus: children in school. Eventually, school psychology would develop on its own, and clinical psychology would expand to include adults, children, in a variety of situations. By 1909, Whitmer and his staff had created a team approach. Doctors examined the children, social workers collected information about the children's life histories, their family, their school, their friends, their communities. The other staff members administered mental tests and looked at things like memory, learning, attention. Many different professionals were involved in a single case. By 1931, his records indicate that he had more than 10,000 patients. One of the reasons why Whitmer was so successful was because his work provided evidence for the early behaviorists' theories. He agreed that the environment played a major role in behavior. He agreed that family members, friends, teachers, community leaders could have an impact on children's behavior. He believed that many issues could be resolved with therapy, with education, training of some sort. And he even came up with a term for it: orthogenics, the idea that we can teach people to restore their weaknesses, to restore any deficiencies that might be diagnosed. Things began to change for clinical psychologists after World War II. A large number of soldiers were returning from combat with symptoms that could not be tied to physical injuries. American psychiatrists could not meet the demand. They needed extra help. And clinical psychologists stepped up to the plate and helped treat these veterans coming home from war. In the late 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, we see the number of clinical psychologists in the United States increase dramatically. It wasn't until after World War II that clinical psychologists began to test and diagnose mental illness. Up until that point, it had been done primarily by psychiatrists and medical doctors. Today, this field has even more power than it did in the mid-1900s. Today, clinical psychologists serve as experts in court. They can admit and release patients from the hospital. They can receive third-party payments from insurance companies. But it took many decades to put these changes into place. After World War II, the field began to tackle the lack of training for clinical psychologists. In 1947, the APA set up a committee to study the issue. 2 years later, in 1949, a group met at a conference at the University of Colorado in Boulder to discuss the issue further. The result was a blueprint for graduate training programs. It was called the Scientist Practitioner Model. It was also called the Boulder Model for training because they met in Boulder, Colorado. The idea was that clinical psychologists would be trained as both scientists and as practitioners. They would be taught how to conduct research, and they would be taught how to diagnose and treat different forms of mental illness. Once the Boulder model was put in place, the number of clinical psychologists increased dramatically. By the 1960s, however, some of them were not happy with the Boulder model. They felt like the practitioner side of the job was being neglected. Some of them wondered why they needed to learn how to conduct research. That wasn't part of their everyday job. Why were they spending so much time in graduate school learning how to conduct research? In 1973, another group of psychologists got together in Vail, Colorado, to discuss the issue. The result this time was the PsyD program, the Doctor of Psychology. Using this model, clinical psychologists would be primarily trained to diagnose and treat mental illness. The practitioner side of the job is emphasized in a PsyD program. Now, at the time, the PsyD was not as respected as the PhD. Unfortunately, this is still true today. Many PhDs will tell you that you should go get a PhD and not a PsyD. My opinion is it really depends on what you want to do with your degree and what you want out of your education. I would highly recommend that you at least consider some of the PsyD programs and take a look at what they have to offer. Don't completely ignore them just because of the stereotype.